Mindfulness is mainstream, endorsed by celebrities like Oprah Winfrey, Goldie Hawn, and Ruby Wax. While meditation coaches, monks, and neuroscientists rub shoulders with CEOs at the World Economic Forum in Davos, the founders of this movement have grown evangelical, prophesizing that its hybrid of science and meditative discipline, quote, has the potential to ignite a universal or global renaissance, unquote. The inventor of mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, Jon Kabat-Zinn, has bigger ambitions than conquering stress. Jon Kabat-Zinn has bigger ambitions than conquering stress. Mindfulness, he proclaims, quote, may actually be the only promise the species and the planet have for making it through the next couple of 100 years. So what exactly is this magic panacea? In 2014, Time magazine put a youthful blonde woman on its cover, blissing out above the words, "The Mindful Revolution." The accompanying feature described the signature scene from the standardized course teaching MBSR, eating a raisin very slowly indeed. Quote from the Time magazine, quote, the ability to focus for a few minutes on a single raisin isn't silly if the skills it requires are the keys to surviving and succeeding in the 21st century, the author explained. I am skeptical. Anything that offers success in our unjust society without trying to change it is not revolutionary. It just helps people cope. However, it could also be making things worse. Instead of encouraging radical action, it says the causes of suffering are disproportionately inside us, not in the political and economic frameworks that shape how we live. And yet mindfulness zealots believe that paying closer attention to the present moment without passing judgment has the revolutionary power to transform the whole world. It's magical thinking on steroids.
Thank you, Ron. Yeah, tell us how you really feel, eh? No, I mean, it's clear there's a lot to unpack just in those 3 paragraphs, and we're going to get into more detail about the critique as we go on. But I'd first just like to ask you, perhaps a little bit provocatively, is there nothing good about mindfulness? Is it not beneficial to sit quietly, just tuning out of ruminative thinking, tuning into the breath, becoming a little bit calmer? Can't that be helpful?
It absolutely is helpful, and I make that point in the book that I'm not denigrating people that may derive therapeutic benefits from their own mindfulness practice. That's really not the point. It's really, the book is really saying how mindfulness plays an ideological function in capitalist society. So I'm not taking aim at people that actually get benefit from practicing mindfulness. I practice mindfulness. I've been practicing various forms of meditation for 35, 40 years. So, but we're at a different kind of juncture here with the so-called mindfulness revolution, which raises questions about how it's been co-opted and how the forces of the market have sort of reframed these practices in ways, because they've been unbundled in ways that we've never done before. And that's really the kind of the trajectory of the critique.
Tell us a little bit more about that. What's been unbundled from what exactly?
Well, mindfulness is a practice that derives from the ancient religion of Buddhism, going back 2,600 years. Mindfulness was one practice in what was known as the Eightfold Noble Path. The Eightfold Noble Path is the path of Buddhist practice. So it's just one part of an integrated framework of ethical and moral development, and also the teachings on wisdom. So we call, in Buddhism, these are called the 3 trainings: ethical training, meditative training, and training in wisdom. So it's been unbundled from that. It's been unbundled in a way that it's been transformed into a technique for attaining physiological calmness. So it's been medicalized. Mindfulness has been medicalized, and this has happened since the 18th century. The history of this process actually can be traced fairly far back, even to a Scottish physician who wrote a book called The English Malady. And this is when nervous disorders, the term nervous disorders, came in cultural discourse. And then an American neurologist, George Beard, based in Boston, there was a fashionable diagnosis in American culture called neurasthenia, a disease of the nerves, a lack of nerve energy. And it was a very fashionable diagnosis in the late 19th and early 20th century for middle to upper class elites. Particularly women were diagnosed with this.
Anybody exhibiting a little bit too much passion for things and a bit overcome by life circumstances would be given that sort of diagnosis.
Right. I mean, this is when we see the Industrial Revolution, the telegraph, clocks, trains, everything, it was just moving very quickly at the time in terms of technological advances. And so people were, the term stress was not in the popular parlance at that time. The term stress didn't emerge until the 50s and 60s with the work of Walter Cannon and Hans Selye, who then began to study response of animals to noxious influences like torturing rats and things like this. I won't go into the long story about that, but the point I'm trying to make is that as we unbundled it from a path of moral and ethical and character development. And you can even trace this history going back to the Stoics and the Epicureans. Because if you look at Western philosophy, the term equanimity was seen as something you cultivate over one's lifetime. It was a form of life. Philosophers in that period of time, it was a practice. It wasn't some heady analytical thing that philosophers did. It was actually a practice, and equanimity was embedded in forms of life. It was embedded in your actions and how you had an effect in society. And so when we medicalized, we've taken equanimity, the cultivation of equanimity, out of that context, whether it's the Western philosophical tradition or whether it's the Buddhist tradition, and we've then turned it into a technique. We've stripped it away of any kind of moral and ethical grounding or any kind of larger social and moral vision of what these practices were meant to be aimed at. What was the theological intent of these practices?
Well, let's zero in on that exactly, because obviously the Buddha was talking about suffering. First noble truth being effectively that all life is suffering until you had sorted out and understand why that is. And he identified three aspects of experience that contribute to that suffering. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what those are and how actually those are part of our social experience too, but the way in which mindfulness is presented sort of leaves all that out of the picture as well.
So I think you're referring to what the Buddha referred to as the three mental poisons, the three roots of suffering, which are greed or selfishness, ill will, hatred, anger, and delusion. And delusion's a little harder to understand, but delusion of that we have an independently, permanently existing self, and that's kind of a delusion that we. Phenomenological delusion that's lived out in our ordinary experience. The
exact opposite then of this self-help approach to mindfulness of pacifying, shoring up oneself.
Yeah, so that's a really big difference. So these three mental poisons, if you look at the Buddhist tradition historically, East Asian Buddhism, Southeast Asian Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, it's been fairly limited to a path of individual salvation. At the time of the Buddha, there was not an ecological crisis. It was not a capitalist economy. It was a different epoch. The focus was on individual liberation, although you could argue with the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism, it was going beyond that, but we won't get into that. But you have these three mental poisons. And the problem now is that these three mental poisons are no longer limited to our own mind stream. In other words, they're not just embedded in our own minds, they're actually now institutionalized in social and political structures. In other words, these poisons now are social in nature and political in nature. a lot of the distress that we're experiencing in society is not just a personal problem. It's not just our inability to be mindful or our inability to adapt. These are stressors that are generated by socio and political and economic forces. And so now the challenge is, in terms of mindfulness, is how can mindfulness be a force for social change? How can mindfulness be a force for alleviating these collective sources of suffering? And the problem with the mindfulness movement, or at least that's how it's been pitched and how it's been disseminated and how it's been marketed, is that it's seen as an individual level palliative. It's seen as basically a form of individual level stress reduction.
Which is presumably still a good thing, though,
it's
coming
still
back
a
to the
good
original
thing.
point.
It's still a good thing.
But it might not change the conditions that are causing the stress in the first place.
Yeah, and it's not an either-or proposition. We still need forms of self-care. But the pendulum has moved way over to pushing the burden of managing one's own stress on the individual, and kind of created this social amnesia. In other words, become more mindless about why am I experiencing so much stress in the corporate workplace, for example.
This does not sound coincidental, given that we're in a country where a Prime Minister a while back declared there was no such thing as society, and ushered in the various economic shifts that have led us to our current state of turbo-capitalism, with everybody running around not having enough money and desperately needing to work harder, and needing a bit of mindfulness to chill out at the end of the day before going and doing it all again tomorrow.
Right.
How does all that fit together then? Where did this come from? Are the people selling mindfulness complicit in some sort of a conspiracy to keep us docile and good worker drones?
No, as I said, most of the people that I know, and many of the leaders in the mindfulness movement I've met, and they're extremely sincere, and they truly believe in what they're doing. And but that's part of the problem in a way, because it may be more unwittingly that they're complicit with the forces of this kind of individualizing social and political problems. So, as you mentioned with Thatcher, there's no such thing as society, right? Basically we then become entrepreneurs of ourselves. We become self-managing. We have to become self-correcting and without any kind of support mechanisms.
Well, there is also no alternative, so all we can do is adjust ourselves to the horrors of the marketplace as best we can before somebody tramples on us, is effectively the background message that a bit of self-care is geared towards. But if these people are not malicious and they're unwitting in this process, why is it that they don't correct course? What is it about what they're doing that means that they can continue to believe in it being a force for good if it's actually hostage to all these other forces that you're describing?
Well, I think it has something to do with being embedded in therapy, being embedded within what's called therapeutic culture. And I think that the mindfulness industry, the wellness industry, it's part of a larger umbrella. So therapeutic cultures have sort of been grounded in starting out in kind of a biomedical paradigm, for one thing. And so when you see problems strictly as biological or physiological, that kind of delimits alternative explanations for distress. It already delimits the discourse, because then you have a kind of a biological reductionism way of thinking about stress, or if it's mental illness or whatever it may be. And that kind of then obscures looking at alternative explanations like the social determinants of mental health, which the UN and with the World Health Organization now have come out with fairly lengthy reports saying we need to move away from strictly looking at things in terms of biomedical explanations.
What about the practice itself, though? What is it that leads people who are purveying mindfulness interventions, to use the therapeutic jargon, to believe that they have this sort of ethically neutral, wonderful, magical cure that will somehow help despite all of these other forces that it's not actually engaging with?
Well, I think there's some sort of belief or faith, maybe we could put it that way, by making mindfulness accessible to as many individuals as possible, whether it be through the healthcare system or whether it be through public school systems or even the government, that we can then affect some sort of political and social transformation, one mindful individual at a time.
But why would that happen? What is it about mindfulness that would change people in that way? What's their thinking?
Their thinking is by making individuals kinder and more sensitive to their surroundings, that then they will make more wiser choices about what they do.
Is that not reasonable?
It is reasonable, but it's not enough.
Does mindfulness make people kinder?
Well, that's a good question. It's also debatable in the scientific literature. There's been many claims that practicing mindfulness alone will generate compassion and pro-social behaviors. But some of the more recent scientific studies that have called meta-analytic studies, basically studies of studies, have gone back and saying that the effects are very, very moderate, if even moderate.
If a bit of mindfulness was going to make everybody kinder, why would the US military be using it as a training tool for pre-combat deployment?
Well, that's... Yeah, well, I mean, the U.S. military is a master of Orwellian doublespeak, and so are many of the contemplative scientists that are taking millions of dollars of federal money from the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army to fund these studies to train combat soldiers in pre-deployment training before they go off to war in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever it may be. In other words, their rationale is that we can optimize warrior performance, but I think it's absurd. It's absolutely absurd to think that. And I think this brings up a major point, is that what is mindfulness for? A lot of people say, well, it works. Well, it works for what purpose and for whose interest? And these are sort of questions that I interrogate.
So it seems then, effectively, in that context, that soldiers are being just given attention training, better able to focus on the task, hopefully therefore make fewer stupid decisions that involve unnecessary deaths, but ultimately be more effective killers.
Yeah, and that brings up an excellent point, because it really shouldn't be called mindfulness. It should be called attention enhancement training, or attention performance enhancement training. Because one of the key tenets of modern mindfulness, or clinical mindfulness, is this notion of bare attention, that we should develop bare attention. But bare attention is value neutral, it's ethically neutral.
So you mean just in terms of the practice, we drop into some sort of state that is unfiltered or pure? In some
Well, enhancing our focus, our concentration. So a white-collar criminal, someone who's trying to crack a safe, has to have really good focused attention. That's not mindfulness in the way that it's conceptualized within an ethical framework or within a spiritual liberative framework.
So the mindfulness movement's use of this term and even this whole concept actually means that if it is as ethically neutral as pure attention would be, it completely undermines their claim that it's got some embedded social benefit in it.
Well, you would think so. A little bit more about the military aspect of mindfulness is because historically it's not actually that new. And I also want to call to task the Buddhist, the Zen Buddhist, because during Imperial Japan, during World War II, many Zen priests perverted the Zen Buddhist teachings, particularly the teachings on emptiness, to rationalize killing. Even kamikaze pilots were trained to what's called samadhi training. So samadhi was also decontextualized from the teachings on ethics, and it was a way of enhancing, this kind of bravery in the sense of the Bushido warrior spirit, and basically having this incredible attention to do what you need to do without any remorse. And so it's not new, and I think that raises a point. What happens when mindfulness or even Buddhist meditation becomes under the rule of state sponsorship, or in our case, corporate sponsorship?
Could it be then that part of the issue is that the people who are teaching mindfulness, who generally mean well and quite often go on Buddhist meditation retreats, although they teach something that they've described as secularized and scientific, are in fact actually themselves embedded in an ethical context that they somehow assume will be transmitted through what they do. So there isn't actually a stripping of the context in practice. They're inhabiting one, they're just not actually communicating it in their mindfulness training program.
Yeah, well, I heard that explanation, that the way that we transmit ethics is through our presence, or through some sort of magical transmission of the teacher to the student. You know, we embody these practices in such a way that it's contagious. You know,
that's an example, though, maybe. And perhaps that does have an impact.
Perhaps.
But perhaps it would have a larger impact if these sort of embedded assumptions were externalized and turned into, you know, clear concepts that were part of the training program.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that if you look at the curriculum, mindfulness programs are pedagogies. They're embedded in usually a typical 8-week program with different modules each week, and that particular curriculum is not cast in stone or anything. And I think that's part of the issue, is that they don't go far enough in terms of contextualizing these practices. And so then what happens is that as you unbundle them and you resituate them as a technique, as a value-neutral technique, then the context takes over, and basically it's a default mode. And the default mode is Western capitalist consumerism and all sorts of profit motives. Remember, this is an industry, and especially in the corporate sector, there's quite a lucrative training and consulting practice to be teaching mindfulness programs in large corporations.
That's certainly true, although there would be the humble mindfulness teachers who are just barely making ends meet, like the average yoga teacher, I speak from experience,
sure.
who would complain that, you know, you're tarring everybody with the same brush there, and that they're not perhaps corrupted by the profit motive, but they still seem to be constrained in some way by a reluctance to bring ethical teachings or something that's less value neutral into the framework, it seems. What should be there? If it's not going to be Buddhist,
Right.
and if they're averse to what's, frankly, let's be honest, certainly influenced by Marxism, your radical alternative to say, if mindfulness is actually revolutionary, this is what it should look like. If they don't want to be Buddhist or Marxist, how might some of these ideas be presented so that mindfulness training actually amounts to more than paying attention?
Yeah, before I address that, let me just make a little more comment on the corporate sector. Is I don't think that you could sell a corporate mindfulness program if you were coming in and saying, "Oh, by the way, we're going to help people de-stress, but we're then going to look deeper into the root causes of the stress in the corporation, and we're going to look at management styles. We're going to look at workloads. We're going to look at corporate policies. We're even going to look at the type of products we're producing and whether we really buy into that." If I was a corporate trainer or consultant, and I said I'm going to do systemic structural diagnosis of
institutionalized greed, ill will, and delusion.
And there's been studies on this, basically. Stanford Business School did a study not too long ago because they were looking at wellness programs, corporate wellness programs, and they found out that the workplace, the causes of stress were not about being distracted employees or mindless employees. No, it was bullying managers, job insecurity, lack of health care, unrealistic workloads, lack of organizational justice. These are all systemic structural issues. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that what would be done differently? I don't think you could actually do it in corporations if you wanted to do it differently, because I don't think people would buy it. I don't think the corporate sponsors would buy it. I could be wrong.
I think you're probably right. So I guess we're talking then immediately about two different contexts. What one is that the main place where a lot of these ideas are being generated. I mean, let's take Google as an example, which sponsors mindfulness events and also, birthed its own in-house mindfulness training program. They're obviously not interested in being held to account when their sort of credo of "don't be evil" is being contravened on a daily basis. So what future then, if that's the engine of this mindfulness industry in a way, these corporations that have sponsored it, taken it to the next level, made it such a force in society that you can make a decent living out of it, and then people train trainers who then go on to do X, Y, and Z. So if that is a force not for good, how can the mindfulness industry be reformed?
Well, I think that's the challenge, is that how do we decouple it from the forces of the market, which is extremely difficult to do.
That's why I say maybe the separation comes in. We have to look at that as a lost cause, and that's another thing. It's not even, we shouldn't call it mindfulness.
Yeah, I don't think that's where the leverage is.
Corporate staff pacification programs.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's where the leverage is in corporations. And,
so where is it?
Well, one of the shifts that the way I got this phrase from you is we have to shift from me to we. And so, because the causes of suffering are
I got it from Muhammad Ali.
Oh, okay. But it's basically rethinking mindfulness more as a form of social or civic mindfulness. In other words, that mindfulness is not just addressing our own distress, but it's actually expanding the dialogue. It's expanding the way that we focus attention on the collective causes of stress and suffering. And so that means how can we wed activism, progressive activism, with self-care, and see that they are intertwined, because suffering in society now is much more complex. It's entangled in different orders of suffering. So first level suffering is our own personal suffering, our private suffering, and that's what religion counseling has been about, and even individual level mindfulness has addressed. But that's not enough. And so I think that where the innovation needs to come from is how do we expand these programs so they're not just interventions on the individual level. How can we expand them so they create forms of solidarity, they create forms of mindful resistance.
Communities of resistance.
And communities of resistance, kind of reclaiming the power of community formation. Because even if you look at it from a Buddhist perspective, mindfulness has always been done in a community. It's a community of practice. It's a community of practice. And what's happened is that it's now kind of seen as a do-it-yourself, DIY practice. You do a 3-minute meditation on your Headspace app. And that's not going to do it. That's not going to shift us in this direction.
Are people doing this already?
Well, a few. I'm actually working on a project. Actually, when I get back to the States, I'm working with the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in outside of Berlin, in Potsdam, which is a German think tank that's working on climate change issues. But there's an interesting group there that are looking at how do we use contemplative methods to help foster a sustainability mindset. So the project's called A Mindset for the Anthropocene. And so I've organized a retreat in the States where we're experimenting with new curricula. We're calling it Socially Engaged Contemplation for Sustainability. And so we've invited socially engaged Buddhist activists, environmental activists, and some climate scientists from this institute. And we're sort of brainstorming how we might be able to do this. So, but there are other people out there too. There's a network called the Mindfulness for Social Change Network, and there are people within that network that are expanding it beyond just a biomedical model, and working in ways to have people. David Smale, who is the late critical psychologist who worked at the NHS. He has a really interesting term. I love this term. It says we just don't need insight into our own personal distress. We also need to develop methods of what he calls outsight. And so to look into the material and social conditions of mental health and well-being. And
the
so
ultimate interconnection of these.
The interconnection of it. Yeah.
One last thing before we open it up to questions. I can't let you go without hauling you up on this. You have a lot of critical words to say about Jon Kabat-Zinn, the so-called father of the modern mindfulness movement, and I feel I should, at this moment, just sort of state the case for him. Hasn't he done a huge service to society, taking a fairly obscure element of a distant Eastern religion, turning it into something that's easily replicable, scalable, deliverable all over the world in the context of a university hospital training room initially, and then all over the place now, and produce beneficial outcomes for millions of people. Surely that can't be a bad thing.
No, and I think for the first 20 years that's what he was doing, until his center became very, after it moved out of its entrepreneurial stage into a state of maturity. But we see this with a lot of, we saw it also with Hans Selye, the father of stress. Once he got a big bully puppet and a big megaphone, then he started kind of preaching utopian ideas of how his methods of stress reduction would save the world and save the planet.
You talk about, I made a note of this, you talk about him at Davos, having no qualms about preaching the gospel of competitive advantage from meditation to a bunch of CEOs.
Yeah, there's no way I could not focus on Jon Kabat-Zinn because he is so influential as the leader of the mindfulness movement.
Could you also talk a little bit about how that ties into your background? I mean, you're not just a Buddhist, you're a professor of management, so there's this kind of confluence of corporate involvement and decontextualization seems to be very powerful.
Yeah, just let me finish this one
Sorry.
thought here, but that's okay. Yeah, I mean, you look at, for example, the parallel is kind of like with Timothy Leary, right? Well, Timothy Leary, got a little too enthusiastic about LSD and how, what it would do, and I think there's a similar parallel with Jon Kabat-Zinn because, he makes statements that it's going to usher in a global renaissance, and if you read some of his writings, it's like even going to solve the problem of fake news. So it's a little overstating the case, I think, in terms of promise, over-promising. It turns kind of into some grandiosity, which I think is really detracting from the credibility of people doing the work. But yeah, even though I'm a management professor, I'm really anti-management. Even though I'm located in a business school, I really shouldn't be. I should be in sociology or philosophy or somewhere. So I've always had this bent, critical bent, towards more of an emancipation of corporations and employees and so forth. But yeah, I mean, once I saw Google and Silicon Valley kind of jumping on the bandwagon with mindfulness, I had to say something. Because management has a long history. The history of management basically are servants of power. I mean, if you look at the social scientists, going back to, even Frederick Winslow Taylor, was called scientific management. It was called a mental revolution, even back then. And it was always, the whole premise is how do we harness, and how do we harness, well, first with Taylorism was how do we harness the physical movements of workers to be more efficient so we could increase profitability and efficiency. But once that sort of fell to the wayside, then we had to figure out how do we harness group norms? How do we harness people's feelings? And that was then the human relations movement in the 1930s and the 1940s. And so we started to train supervisors to ask people how they were feeling on a day-to-day basis, almost like a Carl Rogers approach, active listening and all this. But nothing changed in the workplace whatsoever. No economic changes, no material changes. People felt better, and that was often called cow sociology. It's the idea that if you have happy employees, happy and contented employees, they'll be more productive, like happy and contented cows produce more milk. Yeah. But this has been the history of management, is how do we harness the subjectivity of the worker to align it with the interest of capital and profit making.
And so the problem is that Kabat-Zinn has allowed himself to be co-opted in that process and is proudly participating in it, and yet at the same time claiming he's doing something revolutionary.
Yeah, I think that's part of the rhetoric. Yeah, I think that's part of it.
And there's also the Buddhist aspect. We should just touch on that finally before we go. He claims to have basically summarized the entire wisdom of the Buddha within his 8-week mindfulness training program, and calls it the universal Dharma. So it's all the teachings of the Buddha condensed into something that strips them all out. How does that work?
It doesn't. I mean, it's quite a claim to say that you, as a Westerner, have now extracted the essence of a very complicated, long lineage, a tradition that's vast in nature, and saying that you now have the essence of Buddhism in your method.
Well, he should start a new lineage. I mean,
well, he has started a new lineage, and,
which is modern mindfulness.
Modern mindfulness. And in a way, it is a metaphysical religion. And metaphysical religions, if you look historically, going back to the New Thought movement, or back to the mind cure movement, which goes back to the 18th and 19th centuries, these are how new movements start, by someone who claims authority through their charismatic leadership, not through claims to the tradition. It's a breakaway from the tradition. Now, that's fine, but there are serious issues when you do that, and I think that's what's problematic.
It's also especially problematic in that if you try and pin him down on Buddhism, he'll tell you it's all secular and scientific, and then if you tell him it's secular and scientific, he says, oh no, it's got all the Buddha Dharma in it, and I can hang out with the Dalai Lama and
it's
have a
sacred, yeah.
pat on the head.
Right, yeah. Yeah, it's doing double duty. It's sort of the on position, I call it the Buddhist on and the Buddhist off position.
Switching between.
Yeah, you turn the Buddhist position off, and you say it's purely secular, it's purely pragmatic.
And then corporations will buy it up.
It's a technology, it has nothing to do, no affiliation with the Buddhist tradition, or Buddhist teachings, or any kind of lineage to that. That's the Buddhist off position. If you're trying to bring it into public school systems or receive, federal governmental funding, you certainly shut that switch off. But if you're talking in, conferences like Mind and Life Institute, or you're among other kind of more sympathetic, spiritual Buddhist people, then you turn the position on. And so it's been used as kind of cultural cachet. As kind of a marketing tool to say, look, we have this exotic, but it's not really Buddhist, but it's secular. But if you talk to mindfulness teachers, and this is interesting, there was a study done recently by a friend of mine, and when you interview mindfulness teachers, they say, yes, we have to present it as secular and it's a pragmatic technique. But when you talk to them further, they'll privately say, oh no, this is it. This is the deepest spiritual, most sacred practice there is. But they won't say that when they're presenting it to people. There's some sort of I wouldn't use the word instinct, but cultural patterning where we are trying to protect ourselves, our personal territory, and so this goes to the point of deeply questioning the nature of the self, and where is its boundary? Does it exist in the way we think it does? Because if that's what delusion is that we do think we have a separate body and mind from other people and from the environment. We have the story of separation, which is a part of the modern story, which has gotten us into so much trouble right now in terms of gross inequality, the environmental crisis. We had wonderful technological developments, and what Steve Pinker would say, everything's great, but I disagree with that. But on the other hand, the side effects, the unintended consequences of our ways of knowing keep perpetuating these problems, which is almost like a cycle. It keeps perpetuating itself. So there's something fundamentally flawed with our ways of knowing, which I think that we're trying to figure out. What do we do? Mindfulness is, a nice move in the right direction, but it doesn't go deep enough, and that's part of my critique. I think one of the things is that we kind of underrate the value of suffering. because the happiness industry, the positive psychology industry is all about kind of moving away from suffering. I'm not trying to romanticize suffering, believe me, but suffering is telling us something is off. And I think when it comes to the environmental crisis, that we kind of avoid, we're kind of in denial of what's happening in many ways as a society. And so I think that kind of revisioning suffering as a vehicle for questioning our current ways of knowing. I don't know, it may sound too vague, but like the work of Joanna Macy, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She's done really good work talking about working with grief, like taking on the pain and feeling the pain in a deep way, and feeling the grief, because it kind of cracks open then our defense mechanisms. So in the rush to be mindful, we're often moving away from, I think, what could be like portals for new ways of thinking and new ways of being. And because the first noble truth in Buddhism was life is suffering, not as a nihilistic negative thing, but just the truth. And so if we avoid that truth too quickly, then I think that we then do ourselves a disservice in terms of our potential.